I get this question all the time. If I have $1 million and I'm 55, am I on track? What if you have 2 million by 60? Somewhere in the back of your mind, there's a number and an age that you've been measuring yourself against, whether or not you ever decided to. Maybe it came from a headline, maybe from a coworker's offhand comment, maybe from an article that you skimmed once and never questioned. That number has probably been telling you whether you're ahead or behind. And in today's video, we're going to explore exactly where you should be at each age, how that compares to your peers, and what you can do to level up in the meantime. I'm John Norberg. I'm a certified financial planner and the founder of Norberg Wealth Management. And with that introduction, allow me to welcome you to this latest edition of the Financial Prof Series. Now, if you're wondering how you stack up against your colleagues, there's something critically important we need to define first, because this changes the equation dramatically, and that is that there are two completely different ways to describe how much the average person, if you will, has saved for retirement. And both of them are technically correct at the same time. Federal Reserve data puts the average savings balance for people 55 to 64 at $537,560. The median for that exact same age group is $185,000. Now that's not a rounding difference or a typo, it's a gap of more than $350K between two figures that both get called the average in casual conversation. Now the reason comes down to how each number gets built. Average takes every dollar saved across the entire group, adds it up, and divides by the number of people. Median lines everyone up from lowest to highest and finds whoever is exactly standing in the middle of that group, right? So if a relative handful of households in that group have 7 figures saved, the average gets pulled upward hard, even though most of the room may look nothing like that. In fact, when I was in college, I had a Latin professor who graded on a curve, and it was exactly this math I'm telling you about that caused him to excuse the top 2 or 3 students from the final exam because their scores were curve breakers. It's the same concept at play here. Now, the median doesn't move because of what the top of the group has. It just marks where the actual middle sits. So when a headline says the average 55-year-old has north of $500,000 saved, what it's really saying is that a small number of very well-funded households are dragging the whole figure up. Most people in that bracket are actually living closer to $185,000, not $537,000. Now, the question still stands. Is it enough? And does it actually matter? The fact is, this distinction truly does matter because the number you're comparing yourself to shapes how you feel about your own progress and can even influence when you decide to retire, whether or not it's enough, whether or not you're ready, and almost nobody stops to ask which number they're actually being measured against. So let's start with 55. 55 tends to be the decade where peak earnings and peak obligations arrive at the same time. Kids might still be in college or just finishing up. That mortgage could be in its final stretch here in your 50s, or it might still have a decade left on it. And with many caring for aging parents, it's no wonder that this age gap is often called the sandwich generation. There's more coming in than there's ever been, and yet there's also more competing for it on both ends of the spectrum than there's ever been. So when someone sees this number, a headline number, and they find out that they land below it, the instinct is to assume something has gone wrong. But what's often actually happened is they're comparing a real household with real obligations against a statistical average built from people carrying none of those same expenses, or people who inherited a meaningful chunk of that balance instead of saving every dollar of it themselves. Now, this is also the age where 2 households with nearly identical paychecks can end up in very different divergent positions for reasons that have nothing to do with discipline. One household bought a house in a market that appreciated fast and is sitting on equity that they never intended as a retirement asset. But another is carrying a second mortgage from a renovation or a poorly timed home purchase, or helping a parent with expenses that never show up in any retirement savings statistic. Now, none of that shows up in a national average. It only shows up in an honest conversation about real financial planning, which is why I point this out. Now, if we move to age 60, the picture gets stranger depending on where you look. The Federal Reserve's broader 55 to 64 bracket still shows that $537,560 is an average, and that $185,000 is the median. So that's still the same. But when you look at data from Empower Retirement, their own dashboard, which is pulled from their user base this year, shows Americans in their 60s averaging $1,228,196, with a median of $568,116. That is no small discrepancy. In fact, it's nearly triple the Federal Reserve's average and more than triple its median, describing what's supposedly the same age group. Now, the gap comes down to who's actually in each sample. The Federal Reserve surveys a broad cross-section of American households, spanning the full range of income and circumstance from the bottom to the top. Empower's numbers come from people already using a financial dashboard, tracking their accounts, paying attention to the details. That's a self-selected group, and self-selected groups skew towards people already engaged with their money, often already working with an advisor, often already ahead of the general population before they even opened the app. Neither number is fake. They're describing two different populations wearing the same age bracket. Now, most people watching a video with $1.2 million by 60 in the title have no idea whether they're looking at the general public or a room full of people who are already doing well before they walked in the door. This is why at Norberg Wealth Management, we specialize in tailored solutions for each individual and situation. And if this is something you feel like you've been missing out on, I would encourage you, click the link in the description, book a free consult with us, and we'd love to learn more about what's important to you. Now, none of this is really about which company's number to trust or which data point is better. It's about recognizing that almost every retirement statistic floating around online was built from a sample that may or may not resemble your household, your income, or your habits. The Fed number includes people who never had access to a workplace retirement plan at all, whereas Empower Retirement's number includes almost nobody in that position. Neither flaw invalidates the data, it just means the honest use of either figure is a loose reference point. I have a dear friend of mine who's a psychologist. In fact, he was recently on this channel, and he pointed out to me that the data is key. Your sample set can dictate what your outcome looks like, and sometimes having bad data can poison it such to the point where it completely invalidates the entire study you're doing. Now, so this is where a multiple of income framework starts to earn its keep over either flat dollar figure. A common industry benchmark points to roughly 8 times your annual income saved by age 60 and 10 times by age 67. That framework does something that neither national average can do. It scales to the person answering it. So somebody earning, say, $80,000 in a year has a meaningfully different target than someone earning, say, $300,000 per year. And a single national number was never built to account for that gap. Now, if you run the math on that for a second, someone earning $120,000 a year hitting the 8 times mark at 60 would be sitting on a $960,000 portfolio, a number that has nothing to do with what the national average happens to be that year. But somebody earning $200,000 would be looking at $1.6 million under that same exact framework. Neither of those figures comes from a headline. They came from working backward from an actual paycheck, which is a fundamentally different exercise than comparing yourself to strangers, and even though it's a rule of thumb, ends up producing a more tailored result. Then there's age 65, right? So let's talk about 65, because this is where the conversation changes shape entirely. The Federal Reserve puts the average for 65 to 74 at $609,230 with a median of $200,000. But at this age, the number matters less than what's about to happen to it. And this is the shift from building a pile of money to actually living off of it. Social Security timing enters the picture in a real way for the first time. So does the question of when required minimum distributions, RMDs, begin, and what happens in the years before them when income often drops because the paycheck has stopped, but the government hasn't started requiring withdrawals, at least not yet. 65 also happens to be when Medicare eligibility begins for most people, which changes the healthcare cost side of the equation at the same moment that the income side is shifting. So someone retiring at age 62 or 63 is often bridging several years of private insurance, which comes with its own equations on ACA, Affordable Care Act subsidies, which we help clients with frequently, or COBRA from a job that they had that allows them to carry some health care benefits with them, or even a health share solution before Medicare ever enters the picture. But someone retiring right at 65 walks into that transition immediately. That timing detail rarely shows up in a savings benchmark, but it can move the math on when someone can actually afford to stop working by a meaningful amount. Those years, the gap between retirement and the start of RMDs, tend to be some of the most valuable tax planning windows that a person will ever have. Roth conversions become available in a way that they weren't while a paycheck was still coming in. Capital gains and capital loss harvesting options open up dramatically. Strategic withdrawal sequencing becomes possible instead of theoretical. None of that exists while someone is still earning a full salary from a job. It only opens once that paycheck stops and the income picture goes quiet for a few years. So if the accumulation number was the whole story at age 55, by age 65, it's only half the story. The other half is what happens to the money once it stops growing by default and starts requiring an actual strategy to spend down. Which brings up the real question sitting underneath all of this discussion, the one that rarely gets asked directly. So let's ask it. On track compared to what? A national average was never built to answer that question. It doesn't know your spending. It doesn't know whether you own your home outright or if you're still 15 years into a mortgage. It doesn't know if you're planning to retire at 60 or 72, or whether your household runs comfortably on $60,000 a year or needs $200,000 to feel the same way. You get the picture. The only number that actually tells you whether you're on track is the one that's built from your spending and your own timeline. Not one that's built from a statistical average of millions of strangers carrying none of your circumstances. And that number is also the one that a real financial plan gets built around. It doesn't matter so much what your coworker whose name sits next to you on the Slack or Teams has in savings, but what matters most is your goals and lifestyle, and what that costs versus what you've set aside. None of this makes the benchmarks worthless though, right? They function the way a map of a city might function when you're trying to find your own street. They'll tell you roughly which neighborhood you're standing in, but they were just never built to describe what's actually happening inside your own house. So if you've made it this far and your own number looks smaller than you'd like, or if you'd like to figure out what it should be, well, there's more room to work with than most people assume at every age in the ranges we talked about today. People 50 and older can currently contribute an additional $1,100 to an IRA and $8,000 to 401k or 403b in catch-up contributions, stacked on top of the already existing standard limits. And people ages 60 to 63 recently became eligible for a brand new super catch-up contribution of $11,250. That's amazing if you're in that age range, because that's something a lot of people don't know about but can make a meaningful difference, especially compounded over years. It's a truly powerful adjustment, and over several consecutive years, catch-up contributions alone can meaningfully close a gap that might have looked insurmountable from the outside looking in. Now, here's an idea for you. Run a rough version of the basic math. An extra $8,000, that's the catch-up contribution, per year into a 401k, invested even for 7 or 8 years before retirement, isn't a rounding error, but a meaningful compounding addition to the balance that sits at the end of that runway as you take off into retirement, especially when you layer it on top of whatever growth the existing account was already generating. The point isn't that catch-up contributions alone can close a six-figure gap by themselves, but that nowadays, that runway that most people assume has usually closed, usually hasn't, and looks even better than it has in years past. And for anyone sitting at the higher end of these ranges, wondering if a large balance means the planning work is finished, it usually isn't. A large number sitting in the wrong kind of account, without a real withdrawal strategy attached to it, can create just as many tax problems as a small number creates funding problems. Being ahead of the national average doesn't automatically mean being ahead of your own actual plan. So, to go back to the couple of questions we asked at the beginning of this video, $1 million by 55, 2 million by 60, are those numbers good, bad, or somewhere in between? And the honest answer is that nobody watching this video can tell you, myself included, without knowing what that money needs to fund and for how long it needs to fund it. The number that was always going to matter was never the one sitting on someone else's chart, but the one that's built around the life you're actually planning to live, at whatever age you're planning to live it. So if you'd like to understand not just where you stand, but ultimately what it means, I would urge you to go ahead, click the link in the description, book a free consultative call with us. I would love to hear what's important to you and how we can help. And in the meantime, I'll see you out there.